Corbyn calls on Britain to accept more refugees and economic migrants as the overnight after migrants attempted to force their way onto a Channel ferry. David Cameron appears increasingly confident he'll bag a deal on EU reform next month, including new measures to reduce EU migration to the UK. In the first of 3 Sunday politics debates, the Leave and Remain campaigns go head-to-head on immigration. And speaking exclusively to this programme, Ed Miliband's former pollster Deborah Mattinson criticises Labour's official report into why the party lost the general election for failing to face up to hard truths.
I think it was a whitewash, and I think it was a massive missed opportunity.
Later in the programme, seconds out, the Welsh and UK government are squaring up for another fight in the Supreme Court over new trade union laws.
And with me, as always, the best and the brightest political panel in the business. Nick Watt, Beth Rigby, Janan Ganesh. They'll be tweeting throughout the programme using the hashtag BBCSP. So, the port of Calais was forced to close for a while yesterday after migrants managed to breach security and board a ferry. Amateur footage captured the moment a group managed to break through security fences and head towards a P&O ferry. The incident happened during a protest at the port in favour of migrants. The head of the Road Haulage Association here in Britain has renewed demands for the French military to intervene. Now, as it happens, the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn was in northern France yesterday, visiting the migrant camps in Dunkirk and Calais. While he was there, he reiterated his calls for the British government to do more to help migrants.
I talk to people all over the country, and not everyone's that cold-hearted, not everyone are prepared to reach out, and I think we need a response across Europe that reaches out, and indeed Germany has done an enormous amount, other countries have done varying amounts, and I think we should be part of helping to bring a European-wide support to people, and that's what I'm asking the government to do.
So, Mr. Corbyn, yesterday, Beth, what do we make of this story that the government is now going to allow what they're calling unaccompanied children refugees already in Europe, it seems, to come into Britain?
Well, some of my government sources suggested that that's not what David Cameron wants to do. If you think about how he dealt with this crisis back in August, he said, we will take some Syrian refugees, but we will take them from the camps in Syria and around Syria. We will not take them from Calais, because he thinks that this is a push factor and it makes people come over. And so I think what the government might end up doing is that they might refugee children unaccompanied, but only from Syria and the Middle East, not from Calais.
The kids who've made it here and could be in
quite a
bad way and quite vulnerable. Nick, what's your understanding?
Yes, well, I think the signals from government is that they haven't made any decisions yet and an announcement is not imminent. But Beth does make a very important point, and the Prime Minister said this from the very beginning of this crisis. You do not want to encourage people to make that journey. Therefore, the instinct is to take people from the neighbouring countries.
Except if you've got unaccompanied kids.
Well, indeed.
In terrible conditions
exactly.
in Calais or Dunkirk.
Yeah. And the call to take 3,000 children, that's from that Save the Children report. Right. And that says that that is a fair proportion of the round about 26,000 unaccompanied children that have come to Europe. And the figures in that report are absolutely terrifying. In 2014, 1,000 unaccompanied children who ended up in Italy, 3,000 went missing. Of the African children who went to Italy, half of them had been subject to some form of sexual abuse. It is the most horrific figures in there, and it's interesting that that 3,000 figure, endorsed as you see by Jeremy Corbyn, also endorsed by the cross-party International Development Select Committee. So there is formidable pressure on the Prime Minister on this one.
The humanitarian case is been strongly put by Mr. Corbyn, among others, and yet it's marginal. 3,000 children, be great for them. 37,000 migrants have come in to Greece in January alone, and the month's not even ended yet. 10 times the number that came in last January. This problem is getting bigger and bigger, and all the response to it, I would suggest, from all countries, has been wholly inadequate.
It has. It looks marginal, it looks piecemeal, but I think that's about as much as you can expect until there is EU-wide agreements about how to distribute what you might call the burden of the influx. And there's nothing close to an EU-wide agreement. There isn't really even a deal between the EU and Turkey about sealing borders or dealing with human traffickers, let alone a deal within the EU about which country bears how much of the burden. Until then all you're going to have are these improvised solutions, 3,000 here, France taking a bit more. And there's not even certainty that a lot of these unaccompanied kids are overwhelmingly Syrian. There's a suggestion that actually the Syrians travel as complete families and the unaccompanied kids are disproportionately Eritrean or Somali, similarly distressed, but not quite the problem that you think you're dealing with. And of course the whole thing plays into the referendum question, because there is this nervousness in the campaign that a referendum in, say, September, after a summer's worth of large numbers of migrants coming in, kids or otherwise, would skew the result this way or that.
Right, huge story. We'll come back to it before the end of the show. Now, last week, the long-awaited autopsy into Labour's defeat at the general election was finally published. The report by Margaret Beckett concluded that Ed Miliband wasn't judged to be as strong a leader as David Cameron and that Labour had failed to shake off the myth, as she called it, that Labour was responsible for the financial crash. But parallel research was also commissioned to inform the Beckett report, and despite being completed in July, its findings remain unpublished. The former Labour pollster Deborah Mattinson carried out this research, and she's spoken exclusively to the Sunday Politics. Here's Ellie.
We are saying the Conservatives are the largest party.
We all know what happened on election night. The opinion polls got it wrong. Instead of a hung parliament, David Cameron majority of 12. Labour got it wrong too, suffering a net loss of 26 seats.
Friends, this is not the speech I wanted to give today.
Ed Miliband resigned within hours, but it's taken 8.5 months for the party to publish its own inquiry into what went wrong. Margaret Beckett's report is called Learning the Lessons from Defeat. It doesn't, says one pollster who's worked for several former Labour leaders.
I think it was a whitewash, and I think it was a massive missed opportunity.
Just a few weeks after the election defeat, Deborah Mattinson was commissioned by the acting leader Harriet Harman to research why Labour lost. She says the evidence was meant to feed into the Beckett report, but it hasn't.
I did brief Margaret Beckett, so I was somewhat disappointed not to see some of that reflected back. Yes, I think that she picked up on, but there was actually no analysis. It's reduced down effectively to one bullet point in the report. And in fact, there's a lot of quite defensive stuff about, this doesn't necessarily mean that, anti-austerity is wrong. It doesn't, of course we had a great business strategy. What a pity that the voters didn't notice it. It was probably the fault of the media. So quite apologetic, lots of defensive stuff in there, but nothing that actually really, I felt, shone a light on what had gone wrong.
Do you accept that when Labour was last in power, it overspent?
No, I don't. And I know you may not agree with that.
Margaret Beckett's report acknowledges Labour failed to shake what she describes as the myth that the party caused the financial crisis. But she concludes that Labour was not seen as anti-aspiration and its policies were not unpopular. Deborah Mattinson says for people in her focus, stupid.
Frankly, they didn't trust Labour to manage the economy effectively. They were very concerned about that. In their minds, they are seeing a conflation between the financial crisis, which, by the way, they do categorically blame Labour for, rightly or wrongly, and their sense that Labour would waste money, their money, and run the economy into the ground.
I'm not Tony Blair.
And that was part of the problem. Voters couldn't see him as PM.
I'm not Gordon Brown either.
But Margaret Beckett concluded that Ed Miliband faced an exceptionally vitriolic and personal attack by the media.
People looked at Ed Miliband and didn't see him as prime ministerial. And, if you look at every election since the 70s, what you see is that the party that has the leader with the best ratings is the party that wins. There's no exception to that.
I get it, that people weren't prejudiced about immigration. People felt anxious and insecure. I get it, and I understand the need to change.
The Beckett report acknowledges that Labour didn't quite benefits and that the fear of the SNP propping up a minority government scared off many voters. But Deborah Mattison says Labour was losing support in Scotland well before the independence referendum and the surge in SNP support. Put simply, she says voters across Britain did not feel Labour was on their side. And the party still doesn't realise.
I feel very concerned that the lessons won't be learnt. I can't see how they will be learnt, because that was the vehicle, that was the moment. And if this report doesn't address those issues, then I'm not sure when they will be addressed. No political party has a divine right to exist. Unless Labour really listens to those voters that it must persuade, it stands no chance of winning the next election.
Ellie Price reporting. We've been joined now by the former Shadow Cabinet Minister, Michael Duggar. You might remember he was sacked by Jeremy Corbyn at the start of the month. Welcome to the Sunday Politics. Deborah Mattison says Margaret Beckett's report into why Labour lost the election is, quote, a whitewash. Is she right?
I think that's a bit harsh, to be honest. I think Margaret has produced a very good report. Does it have all the answers? No, of course not. And I think Deborah makes some very fair observations, in the piece that you've just shown. But to be honest, what Margaret concludes in her report was not a massive shot to those of us that were knocking on doors last May and have thought very long and hard about it since, that we weren't trusted enough on the economy, and that was the big issue, but also on immigration and welfare. We were seen as out of touch. And of course, leadership being the most important thing in any race. She makes those conclusions, does Margaret, in her report. And I think the key thing now is that we listen to not just the issues that Margaret raises in her report, but we also listen to Deborah, and we listen to many others who've made a contribution since this report came out, because we've got to face up to those really difficult issues as to why we lost if we're going to win again.
Well, her research discovered that voters found Ed Miliband the personification of the Labour brand. It was his problem, well-meaning but ineffectual, unlikely to deliver on Labour's promises. Didn't any of you detect that at the time?
Of course, lots of private conversations. I was very close to Ed and gave him lots of advice. Some of it he took, some of it he didn't. I wanted Ed to be a success. I saw him in private and knew how strong he could be, that often he got very unfair coverage in the media, and that sometimes he didn't do himself justice in his performances. We saw that he performed very well in the last few weeks of the campaign, but frankly, it's all too late by then. So the real lesson here for any leader of the Labour Party is, all leaders have strengths and weaknesses. You've got to play to your strengths, but you've got to fundamentally address your perceived weaknesses, and you've got to do that early on.
But the private polling that you were getting showed the Tories in the lead, contrary to the public polls. Wasn't that a warning that things were going wrong?
Well, I'm not sure how much private polling I was shown, actually.
Did you not see these polls showing
No, I mean,
the Tories in the lead?
For certainly a year before the election, if you remember, I was appointed Shadow Secretary of State for Transport. I wasn't so much part of the sort of central operation, so I didn't see private polling until then. A lot of us thought that we were getting difficult conversations on the doorstep, but we were told consistently, including by the pollsters, that we were neck and neck, and there was this perception that we were doing better in the marginals as well. Now, that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. But I think one of the things actually that isn't in Margaret's report is about some of the organisational lessons, because that does speak to, if you're going to have a million conversations, what are you doing with that data? What is it telling you? I remember in the last few days of the campaign, when I was sent to Derbyshire, I was sent to Amber Valley. I was sent in Yorkshire to Elmet and Rothwell. I should have been sent to Morley to help Ed Balls. I should have been sent to Derby North to help Chris Williamson. Those are decisions any campaign has got to take based on the information they get in the last few days. But also, in 2010, we took very, very hard decisions, actually 6 months away from polling day, based on the information we had about prioritising resources. I'm not sure that happened either this time.
Well, Deborah Mattison looks at the boundary changes that will be implemented before the next election, that the population are getting older and older people tend to be more conservative. It looks at Jeremy Corbyn, and also what she thinks was the Beckett report's failure to confront why you lost enough. Her conclusion is this, quote, Labour's future is in profound jeopardy. Is it?
I think we've got a massive challenge at the next election. I don't think any political party has a right to exist or a right to be successful in the future. Look, I'm by nature an optimistic person, though. Labour, when we've got our act together, when we've been in touch with the public, we've shown that we can win, and we can win well in the past. I think we can win again in the future.
But is Labour's existence, continued existence, a question mark?
We've got to work really hard, starting right now, to get back in touch with the public. I think one thing that the report, Margaret's report, did slightly skirt around, and this does speak to some of Deborah's criticisms, that whole issue about the politics of identity. You know, there's a reference in terms of Scotland, some of the work John Cruddas and others were doing, but people like myself, you know, in England, where UKIP were the main challengers, have been banging on about this, not just, you know, in the weeks before the election, but for months and years before, you know, and we do need to face up to that. So, you know, no political party has a right to exist, but I think if Labour does get our act together, if we do get back in touch with the public, if we get after the Tories, if we stop picking fights with ourselves, if we face up to the difficult issues that are in this report and elsewhere, we can be successful in the future, absolutely.
Right. Well, there's a lot of ifs there. So in what ways, as things stand at the moment, what can you detect? In what ways will Labour be in better shape under Mr Corbyn heading into the 2020 election than it was in the 2015 election?
Well, what is one of the main conclusions from the Beckett report? It says, you know, we did make some gains, was it 1.5%, but we were stacking up support in areas where we were already strong, increasing our support
so
there.
in what ways will you be in better shape?
We've got to reach out. I mean, look, it's not rocket science, actually, at the most basic level. If they think you're out of touch on immigration and welfare, you better start talking about immigration and welfare.
Well,
that would be a good start.
Well, let's take these two issues. Mr Corbyn seems to on immigration. Certainly it's hard to detect if he would have any limits, and he isn't at all interested in any welfare reforms. Indeed, he's rather against them.
Well, I'm not sure that that is an election-winning strategy. On immigration, look, I made this point to him actually at a Shadow Cabinet meeting. Firstly, I said, you've got to understand what a big issue this is. It's the second biggest issue on the doorstep nationally. It was in 2015, it was in 2010. It's the biggest issue in many constituencies, including mine. And I said, look, many of the answers to this actually about intervention in the labour market, about stopping the pressure down on wages and conditions. I said there are good centre-left solutions to dealing with these problems, about Europe providing more help for communities that are having these kinds of changes and need help with their public services. So I made the point to him on welfare. Look, he's right to say we should be standing up, you know, to help the most vulnerable, the disabled people. But in my experience, you only get heard on those issues if the public think you're for real in terms of wanting to be tough on people who, frankly, are making decisions not to go into work. So you've got to get the balance right.
Do you accept, given his huge support among party members, that Mr Corbyn will lead you into the next election?
I think Jeremy faces a big test in May because we've all seen the polls, we've all seen the personal ratings. The biggest test that any leader can actually go through is a real election. And this May, Jeremy faces a very big test because he was very clear that a left-wing agenda, anti-austerity, is the key to transforming our fortunes in Scotland. I hope he's right. You know, I think we need to win in London, but we've got to show that we can make big gains in the rest of England as well. And we've got to hold on to power in Wales. So that's what I'll be working for every day from now until May. I hope he's successful.
Even if he fails these tests, do you seriously think there will be an attempt to remove him?
I think we've got to get behind Jeremy, and he's got to show us that he can deliver and that he can show that he can turn things around, that the Labour Party is heading in the right direction. I think we need to get behind him in doing that. Look, people are very clear about what Jeremy stands for.
You're not behind him.
He's achieved remarkable cut-throughs, Jeremy, in the last few months. You know, I get it from people in the supermarket queue, in the local pub, you know, and over the next few months we'll see more of that. So he's got to be given his chance because he has got a huge mandate by the party members, but we've got to show that he can turn that into real support from the public. And that means, I'm afraid, also winning the support of people who voted Conservative last time, people who voted for other political parties. It's not an easy challenge. We'll be behind him in that, but he's got to show that we can actually learn the lessons that Margaret Beckett has talked about, and also Deborah and others as well.
We have to stop it there. Thank you for being with us, Michael Duggar. Now, the hole Labour is in is deepest in Scotland, where the once mighty party now holds just one Westminster seat. If Jeremy Corbyn is to win the general election in 2020, he needs to claw back support from the SNP. And the first test of his appeal north of the border is coming up fast in elections to the Scottish Parliament in May. Speaking to Andrew Marr this morning, the leader of the SNP took aim at Mr Corbyn, criticising a plan he floated to keep Britain's Trident submarines, but minus their nuclear warheads.
I wonder what you made of Jeremy Corbyn's suggestion you could keep the Trident submarines and therefore keep the jobs in Scotland but not have nuclear missiles on them.
I think it was ridiculous, and I think it's a sign of just how tortured these debates are becoming within the Labour Party. Now, on Trident, I agree with Jeremy Corbyn. I'm not in favour of the renewal of Trident, and we might have a vote on that in the House of Commons sooner rather than later. And I think the real challenge to Jeremy Corbyn is, can he get his party into the position he wants them to be in, so that we can have any chance at all of stopping the renewal of Trident. For Labour to sit on the fence on this issue or have a free vote on this issue will leave them without a shred of credibility.
The First Minister. I'm joined now by the Shadow Scottish Secretary Ian Murray. Welcome to the Sunday Politics. Let's pick up on the point there from Nicola Sturgeon with Trident. I mean, in Scotland, the electoral choice in this is now clear. If you're a unilateral decider, you vote SNP. If you support the deterrent, you vote Tory. You couldn't vote Labour on this issue because people don't know what you stand for.
Well, the Scottish Labour Party has been pretty clear at our conference back at the end of October. The motion was passed almost unanimously to reject the renewal of Trident on that policy basis.
But it's not party policy.
At UK level is still our policy it was at the general election, and there's a policy review happening at the moment. So the Scottish Labour Party's policy is pretty clear on this. This is a Scottish election, don't forget, and I would rather we were talking about the issues to deal with public services in Scotland, which I think is incredibly important, and these kind of Trident issues are diverting us away from those really big issues of policy in terms of our public services.
The Mattison research that we've been referring to in this programme found that Scottish voters felt abandoned by the Labour Party, a process that they thought started many years before the independence referendum. When did Labour start taking Scottish voters for granted?
Well, I think it's been pretty clear of a number of reports that have been done over the last 5 or 6 years that there has been a process in the party where we haven't devolved the party as much as we've devolved Scotland. The Scottish Parliament coming in 1999 was a tremendous opportunity for Scotland, a tremendous opportunity for the Scottish Labour Party. It's been proven to be so, but I just don't think we've caught up with that. That was in Jim Murphy and Sarah Boyack's report in 2011. Now under Kezia Dugdale's leadership, she's refreshing the party, she's refreshing party policy, she's refreshing that relationship with the Scottish voters, and hopefully that will come through to fruition come the elections in May.
Well, you say that, but you'll know from the briefing, if you were at the Shadow Cabinet meeting, and I'm sure you were, last week by Labour's election director, that you face further electoral disasters in Holyrood in May.
Now, nobody's under any illusions this is going to be a difficult election, Andrew. The polls are showing that at the moment. But what Kezia is trying to do is get a very positive policy platform together, reconnect with the Scottish people, respond to what Scottish people have been telling us on the doorsteps during the general election last year, but in our campaigning and our work since. And she's doing that on the basis of responding to what the Scottish people want. That's what people want to have in a Scottish general election.
But what the Shadow Cabinet was told,
what
the Shadow Cabinet was told by your own election director, is that he expects you to lose all your constituency MSPs, just as you lost all your constituency MPs bar you last May. What can you do to avoid that?
The important thing here is to go back to what I've just said about Kezia Dugdale's positive policy platform. She's refreshing the party, she's bringing in new faces, she wants to make sure the current powers of the Scottish Parliament and the substantial new powers that are coming in the Scotland Bill to change the policies of the Scottish Labour Party in order for us to have a policy platform in Scotland that's incredibly positive, that transforms lives in Scotland. That's what we should be talking about.
What's the most distinctive Scottish policy initiative since Mr Corbyn became leader?
Well, this isn't about Mr Corbyn, this is about Kezia Dugdale. She's the leader
so what's
of Scotland.
The most
this is about Scottish elections.
Policy initiative
We've got a Help to Buy scheme for first-time buyers, which will give people £3,000 to help them on the property ladder. We want to build 60,000 affordable homes. We want to put the 50p tax rate back in to close the educational attainment gap. Those are just three of a number of policies that Kezia has announced already. She's the only one in this election campaign so far actually talking about the issues of public policy in Scotland and putting policy proposals forward. Nobody else is talking about these kinds of issues, and that's important.
That collection of the policies that you've outlined are enough to stave off a further electoral humiliation?
Well, it's just the start of a policy platform that Kezia will be announcing over the next few months in the run-up to the elections. That's just three of a number of policies.
Is a Tory policy in
England. This is about resolving the housing crisis in Scotland that's been created by an SNP government that's been in for 8 years. We're not holding them to account on the record because people are obsessing things like polls. Let's get on to the big issues of public policy. The NHS is in trouble in Scotland, educational attainment gaps getting larger, the transport system's creaking at the seams. All of those have to be dealt with, and there's a real opportunity in this election to talk about the powers that the Scottish Parliament currently has and the substantial new powers it's got to transform the lives of Scots. Let's talk about tomorrow's Scotland rather than yesterday's polls.
How much would a top rate 50p tax for Scotland only, how much would that raise?
Well, it would raise somewhere between 60 and 110 million, depending on where you would have any sort of behavioural change. But every single penny of that would go into educational attainment. Well, when the Conservatives cut the 50p tax rate to 45 back in the 2012 budget, a tax cut for the very wealthiest in this country, the Treasury were projecting it would cost £3 billion a year to satisfy that.
That was for the whole of the UK.
That was for the whole of the UK. So 60 to 110 million in terms of a Scottish context is a lot of money that we can use to cut the educational attainment gap, which has grown much, much wider in Scotland than the rest of the United Kingdom.
Why is Mr Corbyn not cutting much ice north of the border?
Well, Jeremy's won a significant mandate within the party. He needs to now win that significant mandate in the country. But what we're concentrating on at this election is Kezia Dugdale is a new, fresh leader. She's well liked in the public. She's coming forward with very positive policies.
You stress all. And I understand that because she's the leader of the party. I understand that. But is Mr Corbyn an asset or a liability come these elections in May?
Well, he's an asset because he's talking about what the Scots and the Scottish people wanted us to talk about, an anti-austerity platform. He wants us to invest in public services. He wants us to use the powers in the Scotland Bill to transform the Scottish Parliament so we can transform the lives of ordinary Scots. So that's what he's talking about, and that's why we need to get breakthrough by talking about policies rather than personalities.
If you've got Ms Dugdale and Mr Corbyn doing all the right things by your move, why are the polls so dire for you in Scotland still?
Well, look, we're going to fight for every single vote, every single seat. We're going to try and get as many votes as we possibly can. We fight to win every single election. But whilst we're talking about polls and not holding the Scottish Government to account for what is a pretty dreadful record in government for 8 years and not talking about policies and positive policies that Kezia Dugdale's putting forward, we'll not get any traction in the polls. Let's get this election campaign onto the real issues that ordinary Scots want to talk about on the doorsteps, and that's not personalities and polls. That's about holding a government to account that's been in power for 9 years with a pretty dreadful track record, and get some policies on there that says to the Scottish people, the Scottish Labour Party's Scottish Parliament's powerful, and we can talk about tomorrow's Scotland and how we can transform people's lives.
Ian Murray, thank you for being with us.
No problem at all.
Now, the huge influx of migrants into the EU from Syria and elsewhere is putting the future of the EU in, quote, grave danger. That was the stark warning from the French Prime Minister earlier this week. Tomorrow, EU Interior Ministers will discuss a possible 2-year suspension of the Schengen system of passport-free travel. It all comes as David Cameron seeks to put the finishing touches to a new deal for the UK inside the EU before the in-out referendum. But how is the migrant crisis affecting his renegotiation? Since January 2015, over 1 million migrants have arrived in Europe, the vast majority coming by sea. The International Monetary Fund estimates that nearly 4 million migrants will have reached the EU by the end of 2017. Tomorrow, EU Interior Ministers will discuss a possible suspension of the passport-free Schengen area and the reintroduction of border controls for 2 years. The EU is also considering tearing up the so-called Dublin Convention and introducing a new scheme to distribute migrants more evenly across EU member states. It's an extra headache for David Cameron as he seeks to renegotiate the terms of our membership of the EU and bear down on immigration. The Prime Minister's preferred option is a 4-year ban on new EU migrant workers claiming in-work benefits, but that's unlikely to satisfy many Conservative backbenchers. Former Cabinet Minister Liam Fox, who's already said he'll campaign to leave the EU, said yesterday that he didn't expect a British Prime Minister to have to take the political begging bowl around the capitals of Europe just to change our own benefit laws in our own country. And over the next 3 weekends, we'll be staging 3 debates on Britain's membership of the EU. Joining me now to discuss immigration in the EU are the UKIP MEP Diane James, who's campaigning for Britain to leave the EU, and the Conservative MP Damien Green, who supports the Remain campaign. Welcome to both of you. Damien Green, let me come to you first. The French Prime Minister says the future of the EU is in, quote, grave danger. If the EU is in grave danger, why would we want to stay in it?
Because it's useful to us, it makes us safer and
more secure and more prosperous, and therefore it's worth saving from our point of view, and indeed the other member countries.
How does it make us more secure?
And it makes us more secure because the way that we cooperate with other European countries, indeed the European institutions that are set up, things like the European arrest warrant, data sharing and so on, are really useful to our police and our security services.
But we share data with the United States.
Terrorism.
We're not the 51st state.
Not on the same automatic basis as we now do.
No, there is automatic sharing of intelligence information between Britain and the United States through GCHQ and the NSA.
There is, and we have a separate treaty with them. It's not as automatic and quick. I think that the key difference is that we can exchange information now within minutes with other European countries in a way that with other countries in the world it can take, and indeed with other European countries before we sign up to these measures, it takes days and weeks. And obviously that means that particularly in cases of terrorism, and you know, sadly we live in an increasingly dangerous world with global terrorism, actually that kind of European cooperation is increasingly important.
Diane James, Europe faces a migration crisis.
Yes.
Your solution is to turn Britain into Fortress Europe, isn't it?
No, it's
Fortress
not.
Britain, isn't it?
No, it's not to turn it into Fortress Britain. It is to regain border control for the United Kingdom. And that's a position endorsed now by a number of countries, number of member states across the European Union. You've got 5 countries already that have reimposed border controls to some extent. And in the last week, we've had France say that they will extend their border control, their passport control, as an emergency measure because of the terrorist attacks in Paris.
Right.
Now, border control is needed because under the current system, freedom of movement, people, services, transport and such also means freedom of movement for terrorists who come in, for weapons that come in over the Balkan states.
But we have border controls.
We don't have border controls, not sufficient border controls. If somebody comes in via, for instance, the Mediterranean states or via the Balkan states, they have then gained entry to the European member zone. If they
can't then move around.
If they ultimately get their passport, their EU passport, ultimately...
But that can take 10 years in Germany.
No, not necessarily. It's 5 years in Germany, for instance. It could be granted much, much sooner if the Dublin Agreement is actually changed and asylum seekers get a faster processing. They can then come here to the United Kingdom.
What do you say to that?
Well, it's not 5 years in Germany, it's 8, and if you've got a criminal record, you can't get one. So the stuff that Nigel Farage was saying about those disgusting scenes in Cologne was just wrong. But I think it's almost ironic that if the Out campaign is saying that strong border controls are what we need, then actually pulling out of Europe would have the practical effect that our border controls that are currently at Calais, thanks to a treaty we've signed with the French government, would pretty certainly come back to Dover. So all those people we've seen in those wretched conditions in Calais wouldn't have to stay there because they would find it much easier to get to this country and claim asylum here. So actually...
But if they couldn't get in, if they didn't qualify for asylum status, we'd have the power to deport them, would we not?
We would, after a legal process. But the point is, the first point they'd be stopped wouldn't be Calais, when they're in France, but would be Dover, when they're in Britain. And once they're here, of course they can claim asylum. And we know, because we have proper legal processes, it takes a lot of time and a lot of expense to deal with that.
Well, Damien, he's already accused me of getting my facts wrong. He's got his facts wrong here in terms of the agreement in terms of stationing our teams, our support staff, our policing, our border control in the French ports is a France-UK agreement. It's got nothing to do with the European Union. If you're now suggesting that the entente cordiale between France and the United Kingdom gets torn up just because we leave the European Union, I think that's fanciful and I think that's totally misleading.
Well,
so I'm sorry, I don't agree with you on that one. It's very simple.
France signed that treaty with Britain as a fellow member of the European Union. No. And the French Interior Minister has said that, of course, they would look at the Le Touquet Treaty. Of course it would be at risk. And do you think the people of Calais want that camp on their doorstep? Of course they don't. It would be in the French interest to stop doing us that favour.
How would David Cameron's renegotiation of our membership help address any of this?
The area of the renegotiation on this is about the extra pull factor that comes from the perception that the British benefit system is easier to access than other people's benefit system, and that therefore there are people coming here simply to milk the benefit system. And I think what a lot of people think about immigration is that they are much more relaxed about people coming here to work and pay taxes and so on. They don't like people coming here to exploit our welfare
But
state.
what he's looking for, the Independent Office of Budget Responsibility has said, is, quote, unlikely to have a huge impact. And indeed, you may marginalise one pull factor, but by the huge increases, the substantial rises in the national minimum wage that are coming along, you've just increased that pull factor.
Well, I think it's a point of fairness that's what people that's what get people really sort of
maybe
emotional.
Maybe it's
about.
unlikely, in the words of the OBR, to have a huge impact.
Well,
that's on numbers. It's numbers people seem to be worried about,
we can't tell
and this will have very little impact on the numbers.
What the numbers will be, but I do think people can do make a distinction between those who are coming here to work, who benefit our economy and benefit all of us. They pay
but
taxes.
Are we agreed that it's unlikely, even if it seemed to be fairer, that it's unlikely to have any much impact on the numbers?
Well, we don't know, and yeah, we're all.
Well, the OBR is a pretty good guess.
He's guessing. I mean, as you say, they're good guesses, but it's a guess.
Nigel Farage says that he'd slash immigration even if it meant lower economic growth. Do you agree?
There's two parts to your question, Andrew. George Osborne has predicated his fiscal strategy on high numbers of immigration. UKIP's strategy is predicated on let's have individuals who come here on a points-based system who deliver real value to this country, who aren't subsidised via the tax credit option, and who actually meet the needs that we have here in the United Kingdom. Now, currently, as we well know, we want engineers, we want medics, we want nurses, we want lawyers. The UKIP strategy has never ever been to stop those individuals coming in. What we're saying is that the impact of low-skilled immigration on this country is negative, and hence Nigel's position.
But my question was that even if it meant slower economic growth, would you still cut the numbers?
It wouldn't mean slower economic growth. No, Andrew, from the point of view, we've made our position very clear in terms of the value of the money that we wouldn't be paying in terms of membership of the European Union coming back into the United Kingdom economy, and actually in terms of balancing the whole position, that would be a positive for us as a country.
The Prime Minister has reportedly refused to meet a group of 40 Eurosceptic Tory backbenchers who want him to ask for more. They think, given the state of Europe, you can more back to this country. Shouldn't you meet them?
The Prime Minister meets backbenchers all the time.
But he hasn't met this group. They wrote to him in November, and he hasn't met them.
I think any backbencher who wants to meet the Prime Minister has ample opportunities to do so. I'm a backbencher. I can get to see the Prime Minister. He spoke to the 1922 committee very, very recently, so all these points can be raised. I think it's possible that this story is slightly overblown.
All right. Thank you very much, both of you. We'll be coming back to these issues in the weeks ahead, of course. Next week, we'll be debating the economic effects of leaving or remaining in the EU. It's just gone 11:35. You're watching the Sunday Politics. We say goodbye to viewers in Scotland who leave us now for Sunday Politics Scotland. Coming up here in 20 minutes, the week ahead. First, though, the Sunday Politics, where you are.
Hello and welcome to Sunday Politics Wales. On today's programme, seconds out, the Welsh and UK government are squaring up for another fight in the Supreme Court. This time, it's over new trade union laws. We have the since he announced his intention to stand down as an AM at May's election. And it's 35 years since the SDP was formed. We talked to one man who was at the centre of the split. But first, there's another fight on the way between Wales and Westminster, this time over new trade union laws. Now, the UK government wants to tighten the ability of unions to call strikes in the public sector. Ministers in Cardiff Bay oppose the move and say that power lies with them. Bethan Lewis now on what's likely to be a messy scrap.
It wouldn't be the first time that a dispute about who's in charge of what has ended up in a legal fight on agricultural workers' wages and on council bylaws. The UK and Welsh governments went head-to-head in the Supreme Court. Last week, First Minister Carwyn Jones raised again.
If it comes to the point where that bill is passed and its provisions are applied to devolved public services, then we will seek to introduce a bill in this chamber to overturn the sections of the bill that impact in devolved areas. It's a matter for the UK government as to whether they then wish to go to the Supreme Court in order to frustrate the will of this democratically elected assembly.
And this trade union bill provokes strong passions on both sides. The Conservatives feel there should be tighter rules on unions' power to call strikes. The unions and Labour see it as an ideologically driven attack on them.
When it comes to strikes, the law, if it's passed, would allow employers to use agency workers to replace striking staff. 50% of a union's members would have to vote in a ballot calling for industrial action. And 40% of those eligible to vote would have to support a strike to make it legal in key areas such as health and education. The Welsh Government argues this would affect public sector employees in devolved areas, and they say they'll fight to overturn the measures if they're introduced.
It's very clear that we have very strong relationships with trade unions and our public services in Wales. It's very clear to us that responsibility for the public services lies with the Welsh Government under the devolution settlement. This is an intrusion into the devolution settlement by the UK Government. I think that they should now agree with us on the amendments we want to see to exclude Wales from the trade union bill.
I think that's a spurious argument because everybody knows that employment legislation is not devolved. End of story. I think also we must look at trade union legislation across the world in that we have modernised ours, and this is part of that modernisation, to give the recognition to the individual member that their vote actually counts in a trade union dispute.
This week, the Assembly's likely to vote against giving the UK Parliament permission to pass the new law as it affects Wales. If, as expected, it's still brought in, the stage will be set for another clash.
The Welsh Government will vote against granting consent. And I know other parties share our views, so I'm confident that the Assembly will not give authority for the UK Government to legislate in this area. The UK Government may take the view that they are able to do so, in which case we will seek to reverse the effects of the bill in the next Assembly, as the First Minister has said.
If it is defeated in the Assembly, all it really is giving is the views of the National Assembly by majority, but as it's on a matter which the United Kingdom government don't believe we have any particular recognition, that it will be ignored.
And do you think that's right? Do you think it would be right for the UK government to ignore the Assembly's view on this?
It is, go back to the original position, employment legislation is not devolved to the National Assembly, therefore issuing an opinion on it is nothing more than that.
As well as the constitutional clash, the Welsh Government and the wider Labour Party are fundamentally opposed to another of the bill's clauses. At the moment, union members opt out from the levy. The government would reverse that, potentially putting a huge dent in the Labour Party's coffers as the party gets a substantial amount from the unions.
The House of Lords has raised concerns about that. In the meantime, the Welsh Government says a legal fight can be avoided if the UK Government listens. But at the moment, it looks like both sides are standing firm.
Bethan Lewis reporting there. Now, it's been just over a week since the surprising news that Hugh Lewis, the Education Minister, would be stepping down as an AM at May's Assembly elections. It's a brief which will no doubt be central during the election campaign and afterwards. Well, in his first interview since his announcement, I visited Hugh Lewis in his Merthyr constituency and I asked him about standards in Welsh schools and underfunding compared with
the spend per pupil in Wales has been rising year on year. For the last year or so, it's been impossible to figure out actually what the spend is in England, because they have stopped collecting the statistics in the plain, straightforward way that we do here in Wales. So it's impossible to say. The academy and free school system in England means that there are wild variations in terms of spend between one school and another, with some schools being favoured simply because
they fit with the government's political programme. Free schools, for instance, having money lavished upon them in areas where there is actually a surplus of school places. It's no way to run a system, really, if you're looking with an eye to equity.
And yet they're still ahead when we look at the GCSE results. And that was something, this time last year, you were sort of suggesting maybe Wales would overtake England on some measures of GCSE performance. Was that a mistake?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the trajectory is very clear. We very nearly did it, by the way. We're only talking about fractions now of percentage points when it comes to that particular measure. And what's very, very interesting about the last couple of years' GCSE results is that Wales's results just keep on getting better. England's have flatlined and they're stagnant at the moment. So it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out.
So this year, do you want to make another forecast? Will it happen this year, do you think?
No, I think my successor would need to make that prediction. But I'm confident, actually, that we will see a further uplift.
One thing that has been a major part of the policy side of education in Wales over the last few years has been the tuition fee grant, where pupils and students in Wales only pay the first £3,500, the rest you pick up the bill for. It's being sort of reviewed at the moment. Is it something you would like to see continue during the lifetime of the next Assembly?
Well, the central principle of it is something indispensable in my mind. Essentially, what we've done in Wales is to continue to invest in the prospects of young people by supporting them through university, which I think should be the central principle that any reasonable government should stick to. And what it has meant is that our young people now have £22,000 less debt on average when they come through at the end of their graduation year.
It's being reviewed at the moment. We won't know until after the Assembly elections what that review will recommend. But do you think that that principle of that a student from Wales should be able to go anywhere in the UK and not have to worry about those additional fees, the £5,500 you currently spend, should that remain, do you think?
Yes, is a very simple and definite answer to that. Again, it comes back to that central principle. What are you primarily investing in? And my argument would be that it's the life chances of the young person. That takes primacy, even over the very real priorities that you need to address around the institutions, the actual universities themselves. The person comes first, the individual comes first, and then, of course, we do reasonable and commonsensical things to make sure we have a sustainable system.
And that just, I'll have one last pop at this as well, though. For the manifesto, it'll remain as it is, not as a universal element rather than something which will be means tested?
Well, we'll have to see what the manifestos say about that. I think the central principle, as I say, needs to be we will invest in your ambition as a young person, and we will not curtail your ambitions, particularly when it comes to geography. If you really think you're best served across the border or in Scotland or Northern Ireland, that's okay. So we will stick with that principle.
You talk about belt tightening in public services, something we've heard God knows how many times. But as Education Minister, do you ever think, well, here we are once again in this year's budget, the health service getting an extra £280 million, that perhaps too much money goes into the health service when actually here you are trying to drive up standards for schools, trying to give us world-leading higher education statements and having to take money out of your budget to put to the health service?
No. I think everybody and the settled will of the Welsh people would always be that the NHS is a top priority and needs to be there for us when we need it. So we have to meet the needs of the health service. But I am proud, actually, that we have seen an upward investment also in education, particularly in our schools, despite the very difficult times we've been in since 2008.
How hard do you have to fight for the budget? Give us an insight into Cabinet now. When different ministers are saying, well, I need this, that and the other, as Education Minister, how hard do you have to fight?
Well, we all make our arguments, and I try to put mine as best I can and fight forcefully for our priorities. But, you have to remember that you're talking about a Welsh Labour Cabinet with people that share values around that. And although there can be There can be discussion, for sure. In the end, everybody around that table wants to see good quality, a decent public sector, a decent standard of service delivery right across all of our communities, and we're all as one on that.
You're standing down in May at the elections. I mean, how much will you miss it, do you think?
Well, it's been a tremendous honour to represent the community I was born and raised in, and to have served as Education Minister, which in many ways has been my dream job. And I'll always walk a little taller, I suppose, with both those things in mind. So, but it is time for fresh horizons now, I think.
Hugh Lewis, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Hugh Lewis there, starting a series of programmes here on BBC Wales on how Wales works, starting with education. So tomorrow night, Lucy Owen looks into whether she should send her son to a Welsh or English medium secondary school. That's at 8:30 on BBC One Wales. But now it was the party that was meant to break the mould of British politics, but didn't. 35 years ago tomorrow, the Gang of Four walked out of David Owen. They'd walked out of the Labour Party. It had a phenomenal start, but within a few years had dwindled away. But what parallels, if any, are there with the arguments going on in Labour today? Will there be a new SDP anytime soon? Well, in a moment, I'll be speaking to a former Labour MP turned SDP, now Lib Dem stalwart, Gwynnora Jones. But first, Rhodri Lewis, a mere schoolboy at the time, has been on a trip down memory lane.
May 1979, and it's all change in Downing Street. Cardiff's sunny Jim Callaghan was out, and the grocer's girl from Grantham was in.
Where there's despair, may we bring hope.
Meanwhile, the Labour Party was coming apart. Its conference is more about pantomime and punch-ups than policy.
Good evening. Conference at Wembley today, historic decisions and a major surprise.
The meeting in November 1980 saw Michael Foot become leader. This was the final straw for many on the Labour right.
Agonising, like leaving one's family, it was, or divorcing a once loved husband. Absolutely, and there's a lot of emotional pull in the whole thing. But once you've made your mind up, it all becomes different and actually becomes challenging, exciting, a test of your strength and a test of your commitment.
But soon you will find that there comes a time for making your mind up.
And the Gang of Four did make their minds up. They decided to walk out of the Labour Party and form the SDP. At the centre of it all, the former MP for Carmarthen, Gwynnora Jones. Labour to begin with, he joined the fledgling. The SDP scored a string of by-election successes in the days when canvassing through a car roof was still allowed. But the boy from Pontypool always had time for some political argy-bargy.
There comes a time when you cannot, your life will be a living hypocrisy. And that's what's wrong with Mr. Healy and Mr. Hattersley. When you advocate policies, major policies, you don't believe in.
But just a year after its launch, the Falklands War happened and attention shifted to the South Atlantic. The result? The Tories got back in 1983 with a huge majority. And the SDP, well, it got 25% of the vote seats. Another of the Gang of Four with strong Welsh connections says the party failed because it needed time to develop.
When you look at the electoral system, what first past the post makes it very, very difficult for a party to create, start, and in one fell swoop become the government. That was, in my view, never possible. We had to build it up, and we had to build it up by taking Labour votes, and we had to smash into Labour in the 83 election because they deserved to be smashed into. And the failure to do that was namby-pambyism, really.
As Labour moved to the right, the SDP saw its hour had passed and the party merged with the Liberals. Gwynnora still kept the flame burning back in Carmarthen, though, under a new banner, happy to field questions about his change of party.
One or two people have drawn as that. The reality is this, of course, Carmarthen has been well acquainted with that sort of politics before, because remember, Lady Megan Lloyd George switched from Liberal to Labour, and that has always been my answer to some of the Labour people. Now, we've accepted someone from another party who served Carmarthen well for 9 years, and quite frankly, it's a non-issue, because the broad mass of even Labour supporters well understand that there is something fundamentally at fault with the Labour Party of today compared with the Labour Party when I was last MP in Carmarthen.
35 years on, the parallels with the situation in today's Labour Party are striking. Does the example of the SDP offer Labour a way forward, or is it a warning from history that voters don't like parties who can't even get on amongst themselves?
There we are, trip down memory lane there. Well, Gwynnora Jones, I mean, we heard Shirley Williams in that piece there saying that walking out on the Labour Party was like leaving your family. How difficult was it for you as somebody who was there at the time?
Yeah, it wasn't easy, and never was easy. If you've been in a party for 20 years, even I was as a young man, you know, to leave, you thought often about it. Easier for me because I lost an election. But I can imagine for them, the second half of the 70s, in shadow cabinet positions, you know, indeed in government, some of them, you know, had been, it was not easy at all. So yeah, it is like leaving a family. And you're regarded as a traitor. The number of times I was called in the 80s a traitor, and I'm sure there are some people in the Labour Party who think I'm a traitor even till today. It was not easy. And I can tell you it took a lot of time. The Jenkinsites, he'd gone to Brussels. Now, he was ready to make the move. Shirley and David waited till the very last moment, desperately hoping that the Labour Party would change on Europe, change on First Faster Post, change on nuclear weapons, change on all these things, and they didn't. And then they moved out.
But were you ever tempted? I mean, Roy Hattersley says in a film last week, he was saying that actually what you should have done, those people that left for the MP, was stay within the party and try and change things from within. Do you ever think maybe you should have done that?
They did that for years. Roy did that. Now, Roy was one of Roy Jenkins' people, but he didn't come over. Dennis Healy was a Social Democrat. He didn't come over. People like Cledwyn Hughes in Wales was a Social Democrat. He didn't come over. There's about 100 people at that time who were Social Democrats in the Labour Party. Only about 30, 35 actually made the jump. Why? Because of the previous question. It is not an easy thing to do. The Labour Party Social Democrats had been struggling since the days of Hugh Gaitskell and Aneurin Bevan. 20 years. And enough was enough by 1980.
But one of the points, and I guess some of that labelling of it, there's a real belief within the Labour Party that they lost the 83 election so sort of monumentally because the SDP split the Labour vote there. Is that a fair characterisation?
That's absolutely true. You know, the alliance, the SDP Liberal Alliance, had 25% of the vote. We almost came second, within about 1%. And I maintain to this day, if it hadn't been for the Falklands War, the history of British politics in the 80s would have been completely different.
And yet, had it not been for the SDP, maybe Labour would have won in 83?
Possibly. But certainly we didn't help their cause. You know, and the question that somebody had raised that we had failed, we didn't fail at all. Labour had to change. Neil Kinnock changed. Look how Neil changed. Blair, SDP Mark II. The SDP didn't fail. It wasn't they that finished the job.
I just think when we're looking at 35 years tomorrow since the SDP was formed, are the parallels between the Labour Party at the end of the 70s and the Labour Party now just too irresistible to ignore, do you think?
There are some parallels, but they're different now. Back then, it was the power of the trade unions, it was anti-Europe, and a number of other things. The Labour Party is not so much anti-Europe now. The power of the unions is gone because it's one member, one vote. It is now about social policies. It is now about economic policies. And yes, there is one link, defence, Trident. It was there in the 70s and the 80s. It is there now. And there are Social Democrats inside the Labour Party now, without question. The problem for them is they are not as well known as Jenkins and Owen and Shirley Williams. They are not people that can immediately attract attention. So there is that problem.
But what about this issue that there is a very clear and public rift within sort of the left and the right of the Labour Party
Yes.
on quite a lot of issues now,
Yeah.
and it's coming to the surface time and time again. I mean, do you think that could lead to a similar breakaway group?
Eventually.
Do you think it will? Or
Eventually, yes, because somebody, Corbyn and his people are in control, and you can't deny that. He has got 60-70% of the vote. Now, he's entitled to be the leader. It's up to the others how are they going to cope with it. Are they going to live within that system? Are they going to be quiet and live with it? Or are they going to say, like the SDP did by 1980, after 4 or 5 years, we can't cope with much more of this?
But what would be your... I mean, you see yourself as an outsider for the Labour Party now, very much involved with the Liberal
Yes.
Democrats. But what would be your advice, I guess, for anybody within Labour now thinking that they're not happy with the direction of the party?
Well, I can't give them advice about what they want to do, but I tell them one thing. If we are talking of realignment in my terms, it's got to be about issues that they would agree with the Liberal Democrats, for instance. Voting reform, constitutional reform, Europe, the environment, a lot of issues. I'm not too interested in Social Democrats on the right of the Labour Party who disagree with Corbyn because he's an out-and-out left. They've got to have principles that they believe in. What do they believe in? Now, the Gang of Four had clear principles. They had clear principles on Europe. They had clear principles on the one member, one vote. There were many clear things. Now, the Social Democrats in the Labour Party need to have that sort of...
Gwynnora Jones, it's a fascinating time, but we have to move on. Don't forget, you can follow all the latest on Twitter with politics. But for now, that's all from me. Diolch am wylio. Thanks for watching. It's time to go back to Andrew.
Can David Cameron keep his party together in the run-up to the EU referendum? Will the SNP stymie the PM's plans for a summer vote? And who'll go along to John McDonnell's Economics Roadshow? All questions for the week ahead. Nick, Damien Green kind of downplayed the 40 Eurosceptics who've written to the Prime Minister asking for more and wanting a meeting. Is he right, or is it a serious division for the Tories?
Well, it was a very diplomatic response from Damien Green. I think what Downing Street would say in their heart of hearts about that letter from John Barron is, well, what's the point of meeting John Barron and his 40 merry friends? Because they want to get Britain out. They've always wanted to get Britain out. And the demands that they're tabling in that letter, which is to have absolute primacy of the UK Parliament over EU law, is not in the negotiation and is not going to happen. But I do think there's an important point there, which is that David Cameron was quite dismissive of John Barron in the House of Commons the other day. And he perhaps needs to maybe just occasionally show a little bit of charm and a little bit of sort of listening to those sorts of people. Yes, they're on the other side to the Prime Minister, but he's got to manage this process carefully. The party's going to divide, but he does need to avoid a civil war, and he can avoid that civil war if perhaps all sides are respected in this debate.
Presumably the 40 who signed are quite hardcore Eurosceptic, but there are more Eurosceptics than that. Even if Mr Cameron gets nearly all of what he's asking for, how many Conservative MPs will still want to come out?
Well, I think, going back to the Barron point, the 40 that have signed that letter are the unbiddable group, and I think what Downing Street and the Treasury have done is they've put them to one side. And as you said, the battle really now for the party is what do you do with those maybe up to a third of the party that would be minded to leave, maybe about 100 MPs to 150 even. And I think it was very interesting, a story in the Sunday Times today, Osborne talking about emergency brakes on actual legislation, if things are coming through from Brussels that the British don't want. So what they're trying to do is they still think the negotiation really is in play, and what we have to do is try and pick off moderate Eurosceptics, give them a package that they can come behind us on, and we need to just accept that there will be 40 hardcore outers that we implicate.
In the Cameron nightmare is the potential backdrop to this referendum. We've had the French Prime Minister saying that Europe's in grave danger. We've had President Tusk of the Council saying we've only got a couple of months to sort out this immigration issue. We've had the Dutch Prime Minister giving warnings as well. If there's a sense that Europe is falling apart, particularly on the migration crisis, Schengen swept away as it may be tomorrow, that's not a way to win a referendum.
No, it's a huge advantage for the Brexit campaign, and it distinguishes them from their predecessors of about 20 years ago. Leaving the European Union back then was seen as almost a pessimistic thing to do. And now you can almost support Brexit because you think, why chain yourself to a continent that's losing when there's so much dynamism elsewhere in the world? So the character, the optimism of the Brexit campaign, I think is a challenge that Cameron has to surmount. He can't paint them as being entirely insular anymore. I used to think that the internal Tory problem would be absolutely explosive. It would be either, if not a mid-19th century Corn Laws style split, then a mid-1990s rolling crisis within the Tory party over Europe. And I no longer think that's true. I think the fact that they know they can expect to be in government until at least 2025, if they just maintain some basic cohesion because of the weakness of the Labour Party, is a huge point of contrast from the 1990s. And I think there'll be some arguments. Cameron will look like he's losing control during periods of 2016, but ultimately there won't be anything existential going wrong for the party.
Now, we know, or we believe, the government is anxious to get it out of the way by the end of June, maybe first week in July at the latest. But Nicola Sturgeon on Andrew Marr this morning had some interesting things to say about the timetable for the referendum. Let's just hear what she said.
We had a negative, fear-laden campaign from the No campaign, and they almost lost. In the referendum for Europe, the EU referendum, the two campaigns are much closer to start with, and if the In campaign falls into the trap of the No campaign, I fear it will lose.
Now, Nicola Sturgeon had said that she doesn't want a June referendum. She thinks it's too soon. And you can say, well, that's just the view of the First Minister. She doesn't have a vote in Parliament. But it may have more significance than that. I was briefed last week by a senior Scottish nationalist who said this: many Conservatives will not want a June referendum. The Eurosceptics, they want longer time to lay out their case. They would much rather have it in the autumn. And the Scottish nationalists, I was told, will not vote to help the government get a June referendum there. So there could be a parliamentary tussle to meet the Prime Minister's
there could be
timetable.
Yeah, the SNP could try and turn it into a vote in the House. Then it depends on what Labour do. Do Labour want to have it in June or later? I actually think that the Eurosceptics are so focused on trying to get this referendum through. I don't think that they, as long as they feel that they have the campaign in time run up that they want, which was the 4-month period, I think that they will go for it.
You see, I'm not sure that's true. I think given the divisions in the Eurosceptic side at the moment in the Out campaign and the various organisations, I think they feel they need longer to get their ducks in a row. They also think the best time for them to fight it is after there's been another major migration crisis in the summer. They know that when that happens, people look more kindly on their side of the argument.
That may be true, but it's quite difficult for Eurosceptic Tories who've spent the last 2 decades saying we must have a referendum, and every time one doesn't they say this is outrageous against democracy, for them to argue for a delay. But I do think that Nicola Sturgeon's intervention is very significant, and I think that the pressure on the Prime Minister to listen to what she's saying will not so much come in Parliament, it could come from the Electoral Commission. The Electoral Commission has already said we cannot have this referendum in May at the same time as the devolved elections. And if, let's say, you were to have Nicola Sturgeon, Arlene Foster, the new First Minister of Northern Ireland, and Carwyn Jones, the First Minister of Wales, if they all said, we think this is overcomplicating, because don't forget, the EU referendum campaign has officially to be 10 weeks, therefore it is going to take place at the same time as the devolved elections. If they all says that's too confusing, and the Electoral Commission were to make another intervention, that would be significant. Well, and then you could be bouncing into September.
Privately, the Electoral Commission has been saying that they don't want an overlap, that there should be a clear gap between the referendum campaign and the local elections, the Assembly, the parliamentary elections in Scotland.
Yeah, they're quite a low view of the electorate and the electorate's ability to discriminate from election to election. But I think the Commission is an obstacle. I think Nicola Sturgeon is an obstacle. But the principal obstacle is just the possibility that Cameron's negotiation is delayed by a few weeks, which is eminently foreseeable, I think.
And you don't think that it's going to be a done deal in the February summit?
They're putting a lot of weight on one summit, and all it takes is an external shock another big migrant wave, a terror attack, whatever it is, and suddenly British renegotiation is no longer the #1 item on the EU's mind, and actually it's the next summit that matters. And it takes one delay for us to move beyond June and then into September. I used to think that 2017 would be more likely. I've slightly revised that view, but I don't think June 2016 is doable.
Well, we've got Leave, we've got Leave.eu, I think we've got Go as another one, but there's another Out campaign, and it's called, it's Grassroots Out. And it was there with us, Liam Fox, Conservative, Nigel Farage there, Kate Hoey, I think, from Labour was there. It was launched yesterday. Nick, I mean, at some stage they have to consult, if they want to be serious and marshal all their resources, they have to have a single Out campaign, do they not?
And by law they have to.
That's what we had in 1975.
By law they have to. The Electoral Commission is going to have to designate a campaign on either side. And it's pretty clear that the inside they're coalescing around this Britain Stronger in Europe group. But as you say, on the outside, there isn't that agreement, and there's feuding between these two groups, and they are going to have to reach agreement. The problem they have is who is going to lead them. Nigel Lawson, who's a key figure in Vote Leave, says we will get a senior cabinet minister. Well, I reported last week that the most senior cabinet minister who is going to go for Brexit, Ian Duncan-Smith, he's going to do his own thing, which leaves you with Chris Grayling. I mean, he'll campaign for Out, but on his own terms, which leaves you with Chris Grayling and Theresa Villiers. Now, they're going to go up against the leader of the In campaign, who's going to be somebody called David Cameron. And so they really do need to get unity. Vote Leave say they're a more grown-up group. Leave.eu say that they're a more grassroots group, but they have got to find some sort of agreement.
Actually, interestingly about who will lead it, in terms of Chris Grayling, someone said to me the other day that actually Grayling's view is that lots of senior figures in the party should be voices, i.e. he was sort of suggesting he didn't want to lead it and that there wasn't going to be one senior cabinet minister that was going to champion it, which gives them another problem about who to get.
I think the organisational, factional differences matter a lot less than who you have as your face and voice. And it doesn't have to be a cabinet member. It could be a very, very prominent business person, the head of a major company.
Who knew how to debate.
Absolutely, and
which is not true of many businessmen.
And who in
public,
and who in particular deals with the question of economic risk, which is the way you grind down an exit campaign.
I mean, the Stay In campaign was launched by the chief executive of the
Stuart Rose.
Stuart Rose from about.
It was a disaster. It was a disastrous launch.
Any of you going to John McDonnell's first economic seminar?
Washing my hair.
You wash it very well. Well, it's on Tuesday. He's doing a whole series of economic seminars around the country. He wants to get out the Westminster bubble. For the first one, he's only managed to get to the West End in London, but he's got a very prominent economist there. And I like a good economic seminar. I want you to come with me.
But I tell you what, Andrew, it's interesting. There's lots of people in the Labour Party that are obviously really worried about Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. But the one thing those critics are saying they're quite encouraged about are these seminars. Is this economics panel he's got? So he's got some incredibly serious people, and he's opening up these seminars.
And his article in the Sunday Times today on Google, on whether this is a good deal, was a very reasoned and thoughtful article on whether this is really such a good deal for the British taxpayer. I can feel I'm going to be on my own. Anyway, they're sold out. There's probably no room for you. Anyway, that's it for today. Joe Colborne will be back with the Daily Politics tomorrow at noon on BBC 2, and I'll be back here on BBC 1 next Sunday for more Sunday Politics. Remember, if it is Sunday, it is the Sunday Politics.
Football analysis of the weekend's big games and Match of the Day 2 Extra over